Oh, good day to you. And I want you to think about what your day is going to be like in terms of all the media that you'll be exposed to just through your normal travels. Think about what kinds of TV shows, what kinds of magazines, what kinds of newspapers, if newspapers at all, what kinds of radio songs, what kinds of billboards, if you want to expand it that way, films, etc. What kind of stuff are you going to bump into today as a part of your regular travels? For me, my morning, although I don't know how the afternoon is going to turn out, my morning starts much the same. I wake up, look at my phone before I quite get out of bed, maybe check Facebook, email for sure, see if there's any text that came in. I'm probably like you. That's probably the first place I'm going where information is coming in on a media device. And then I'm coming downstairs, getting up pretty soon after I wake up, and I'm coming to that spot right there because that's where my newspaper is. My newspaper having come in the middle of the night, somewhere around 2 or 3 in the morning. Then I'm going to lay it out over here. I'm going to lay it out here on the countertop, and I'm going to eat my breakfast, have a cup of tea, that cup of tea right there. Computer sometimes by the side, not always when I'm eating. You know what it's like to use a computer with greasy fingers. And of course, there's my book there today for class. Over here is a television, but I'm not going to be using that in the morning. That's not part of my regular routine. I might watch it later tonight. Probably not. I have one in my bedroom. That's probably where I'll end up doing TV late in the day, late in the evening. Along the way, I'll be getting into my car. I'll be driving. I'll probably at some point scan across radio stations, including our own WESS radio. I might pass some billboards. I don't have any doctor's appointments today, so it doesn't mean that I'll be listening to any TV talk shows or game shows that are playing in the lobby while you're waiting for your doctor to see you. If I need to get gas, there might be a radio station playing on the speakers as I'm filling up the tank. And as I pass other people, they may have their windows open and be either listening to music or listening to radio. You get the idea, right? The media that you are exposed to on a daily basis is somewhat partly your own routine and what you choose to access, and yet it's also something that's kind of random as well. And that describes this chapter on accessibility of media. And that's why I liken the accessibility element to those branches on the tree that are getting away from the main branches and they are extending to the leaves wherever those leaves are positioned on the tree. So accessibility are those smaller branches, some of which you can't reach, others of which you can reach quite easily. In the media world, this refers to the extent to which you have to go to trouble to access the media in your lives. Is it free? Do you bump into it? Can you carry it with you somewhere, like a newspaper? I can't carry a television set. Is it something that you pay for on a weekly basis? Is it something that you pay for on a monthly basis? Is it something that you have to be 18 to access? Accessibility has to do with, on your daily basis, as part of the culture you live in, what do you normally bump into media-wise? And we know that there are some terms that we need to become acquainted with to understand this chapter, so I'm not going to go over all the terms here, and I'm not really big on listing vocabulary when I write, but I felt that it was very needed in this chapter to list the terms that we would be using so that we have an equal idea when we're applying these concepts to one medium versus another medium in a different country. For example, the difference between a tabloid and a broadsheet is described in the list of terms in this chapter, and that's something that you should read. A tabloid is a kind of newspaper that doesn't just refer to the shape of it being like a tablet from ancient biblical times, but it also refers to the style of content that comes out, which is often more entertainment oriented, more sensational, in part because the tabloid is meant to be read in a small space. And so it's in a small space, and it also has a more of a portrait aspect ratio to it. And so it's more inclined to people. People fit well in portraits as opposed to horses, which go better in landscapes. So these are just a couple small ideas getting at these two particular terms. There are others like channel and network and station when we're talking about broadcast media. So I want you to spend some time in this chapter going over those vocabulary terms so that you're able to understand the rest of the chapter's analysis. And also I want to say that this is a chapter that you should have the book with you. If not necessarily while the instructor video is taking place here, but definitely to go back and look at the photos. This is the chapter above all else that I put a lot of photos into because it's just the best way to tell the story of what accessibility is like in each individual country. And I'll be referring to those photos as I go through the instructor lecture. So if you happen to have your book handy, pause the video, grab your book, open it up to page 142. That's the first photo that we're going to come to. All right, so let's go. France. France is a very interesting country when it comes to accessibility of media. When it comes to newspapers, you have these really serious, very political, very politically diverse newspapers, as we've discussed before, but they also have very, very low circulation. France has one of the lowest circulations of newspapers in the country. Just about a third of the people in France are reading newspapers on a regular basis, and that's because the ideas are so lofty, so politically charged, so intellectually challenging in French newspapers. They're just not for everybody. French newspapers aren't doing the sensational Globe stuff, National Enquirer stuff. They don't do that. They leave that to magazines. So French newspapers are appealing to a very elite audience in France. You have very far-right newspapers, very left newspapers as well. You have communist newspapers, you have anarchy newspapers, a lot of the same themes that we talked about with radio. Moving now to radio. In radio in France, as is the case in TV, you have a strong presence of public stations, public channels, really, is what I should say to be precise. Public channels. These are channels that are designated by the government-operated agency that funds these stations through the license fee. And so you have, if you look at the first 5 TV channels that you can access on your average cable box in France, 3 of them, 3 out of 5, are going to be French public broadcasters. Just think about that. It kind of blows your mind when you think about how you're going to be much more inclined to watch those since they're so early in your selection. 3 out of 5. And you can see how they specialize there. Some are general, some are more specific. And there's one channel, interesting enough, that is shared with the Germans. Half of the day is programmed in French, and the other half is in German. And of course, that's where the two countries touch. So in radio, you have a strong public radio presence. Same with TV in France, strong public TV presence. Radio listening, as we've mentioned earlier, is very diverse. There's all kinds of different formats of radio in France, from anarchist to communist to Jewish radio. Television and radio are both focusing on French culture. We'll get more about that when we get into content. But these are the main features that speak to accessibility of media in France. Moving on to the UK now. When it comes to the UK, you have very high readership. We mentioned earlier the Brits love to read. They're reading books all the time. Same goes for newspapers. And that's why you have so many newspapers. And here you really have the division between tabloids and broadsheets. But the tabloids in England are not necessarily like the tabloids in the United States. The tabloids in England, of which there are 5 main ones, all national, anybody in the country can pick up one and it'll be of relevance to them. All 5 of these also have very serious news. They are breaking news all the time. They are read for serious news, and yet they are also showing celebrities naked on the beaches of the Mediterranean. More about that again when we get to content. But to suffice it to say, Britain has a very well-developed array of newspapers in both tabloid and also broadsheet. When it comes to radio and TV, similar to France, we have the public broadcast stations, although technically all stations are public broadcasters in England, just the way they define it. But in terms of what we think of as public broadcasters, we have the BBC. So you have all these BBC channels on radio, and then you have all these BBC channels on TV. Again, out of the first 4 channels you turn on in England, the first 5 channels, again, 2 of them are BBC channels. Excuse me, BBC One and BBC Two. Radio-wise, I just want to mention, we'll discuss this again. Excuse me, I need a Kleenex. I just want to discuss this in a little bit more detail when we get to content, but I do want to point out here that radio in Britain for the BBC also means that they are broadcasting pop music, like what we would consider to be a WSBG. If you're from this area, that's a top 40 kind of radio station for the most part. You will have that as a public broadcaster in Britain. And isn't that interesting? Because we don't see that in the US. That's actually public broadcasters or the country's government saying, why shouldn't the public broadcaster also be involved in the young tastes of our youthful generation? Why should public broadcasters only be doing more highbrow entertainment like you see on PBS? We just don't have a pop hits public broadcaster in the U.S. Think about that. It's kind of profound. All right, moving on now to the next country, which is the USA. In the USA, the main feature here of the accessibility of our media is it is predominantly advertising based. We have very, very few and far between choices to bump into public broadcasting. Again, just think about your own daily travel today. Are you going to bump into public broadcasters? Probably not, unless you specifically go seeking NPR, which is available here on 94.3 when you're at ESU, because we have a repeater, which is a device that repeats the signal from the original broadcaster in the Scranton area, WVIA. And unless you choose to go to 94.3 to listen to it, you're probably not going to bump into any public media whatsoever all day long. Think about that. It's pretty amazing. But what you will bump into is a lot of the commercial networks on television: CBS, NBC, ABC, Fox, ESPN. It's actually owned by ABC. And you will also experience the same thing when it comes to radio. Commercial radio. Over on the newspaper side, we do have something unique here in the U.S. Excuse me. We have the newspaper carrier deliver newspapers to the doorstep. And so that makes our country very, very unique. It's a situation where we have the convenience of the newspaper coming up our driveway and being delivered directly to our house. And so that also then makes the accessibility of the local newspaper, the Pocono Record, much more common than big city newspapers like the New York Times and the Philadelphia Inquirer, unless you're in that big city and buying that newspaper. All right, I see now as I'm going through my notes here, I did skip Sweden. I didn't mean to, so I want to backtrack. I apologize for that. Sweden, like the UK and also like France, has a strong presence of public broadcasters. Over there, they are called the P stations, but they have P1 through 7. One of their radio stations is entirely Finnish language programming, just for Finnish people, since they're so close country-wise. I've actually taken a boat from Sweden to Finland. And since also they have so many Finns living in Sweden, they actually have developed a public service that is, this station is delivering Finnish programming to cater to those people's interests. Something to mention about Sweden is they have the highest newspaper penetration. They read newspapers, and they receive their newspapers in their houses like we do. They can also buy them when they go to train stations and in towns. They have kiosks. You can see those in the photographs. In the book, I have a few photographs of kiosks. It's something that we don't see that much in the U.S. Kiosks where you can get a newspaper, get a candy. If you're a smoker, buy smokes. These kinds of things. Very small little booth there, right there on the street. Very convenient. Also carrying newspapers. Swedes can buy those there. It's one of the reasons that makes them such a high newspaper-oriented country. Over on the TV side for Sweden, very interesting here. They're limiting the presence of commercial television. So they only have 3 commercial television channels. 2 of them are public. 2 of them are Swedish government license fee funded, that is, and only 1 of them is commercial. They don't want there to be a bigger presence of commercial programming in the TV market than there is public program. Isn't that interesting as a philosophy? All right, moving on now to Mexico. Mexico has some similarities to Lebanon. You see some corruption here in a way that we haven't discussed, and that is in the newspaper realm. You have so many newspapers that are published in Mexico. There's just no limit to how many newspapers you will see for sale. When you go to even the smallest dusty, dirty. I don't mean dirty like disgusting dirty, but dirty in terms of no paved highways, no paved roads, and public facilities. Even the smallest of towns, you can buy newspapers in Mexico. And you can buy national newspapers, and you can buy local newspapers, and you can buy state newspapers and regional newspapers. There's a lot of newspapers being put out in Mexico for very few readers. Because like Ghana, people get a newspaper and they pass it around. So one person passes around newspaper to many people. But the corruption comes into play in that the Mexican newspapers are selling advertising to the government. Do you remember that? We didn't discuss that in this class, but that's one of the biggest features of Mexico that makes it different, is the government buys advertising time, funds its newspaper industry and TV and radio to some extent by purchasing advertisements to get messages out about its efforts to improve education, to overcome poverty, etc. So in the newspaper realm, the newspapers don't want the government to know that the audiences for the newspapers are smaller than the government might think. So the newspapers don't publish the circulation figures. So we don't know what the circulation is of many newspapers in Mexico. And that's just fine with the newspapers because they're happy to receive the government monies for the advertisement, and the government's happy to have newspapers allow them to send their message out.